For having me. This is great to meet all of you. I'm Kent Honl. My employer for 32 years since the previous century has been Rainbow Treecare based out of Minnetonka, Minnesota. And I'm also an adjunct faculty at Hennepin Technical College where I teach arboriculture, one course per semester. It's an intro course and then an advanced course. And I'm going to talk about building landscape resiliency, the role of arborists in doing all of that, and continue with a little bit of my introduction. There, I'm in the White Mountains in New Hampshire in that picture. I love that area of the world. Actually, next week, heading back out there, heading up to Maine and New Hampshire for a wedding and some hiking. Love it out there. I've been with Rainbow Tree Care since, as I mentioned, since 1994. Hennepin Technical College in the landscape horticulture program since 2014. So really, I just talk about trees all day and I get paid to do it. And somehow that's my best kept secret. I try to not let the wider world know that I don't really work and I get paid to do this. And I originally grew up in northern Minnesota, Roseau, right off the border of Manitoba. So I'm really a northern Minnesota guy, and I'm kind of living in the city and learned to be semi-domesticated, but thriving there too. In Minneapolis is where I'm speaking today from. So today I am interested in talking about how arborists are engaged in building landscape resiliency. We've been focused so much on the individual tree for so long, but we're shifting our perspective on that now. But our specialty all along has been helping trees within the built environment in cities, in towns, areas that are not natural forests. And we've got this newer focus that's starting to turn towards the urban ecosystem with a special challenge of climate change that's coming at us now. That's been going on for a while. But since day one, arborists have been the original environmentalists working to help cool cities and make them more pleasant places to live. So we've got a set of tools within our grasp that are uniquely suited to this challenge for our times. So how are we doing this? Well, the whole idea of keeping woody plants in good shape is to withstand the ups and downs that happen just in seasonal fluctuations. That makes a larger buffering capacity. If you've got big mature trees and mulched areas, they will withstand swings of drought and deluge and hot and cold much better than other kinds of conditions where you just have, a sidewalk with a few tree pits and cutouts in the pavement for a couple of skinny trees to try to live. Because right now, conditions are getting more and more unpredictable. Those are becoming the norm, like with heat and drought that sets in, and then deluge. It seems like the era of just nice, steady precipitation seems to be over, that we swing between these extremes. And no snow cover, too. That raises havoc with trees. At least in Minnesota and the metro area, we can't really count on a good, steady snow cover like we used to. Up north, yes, and makes me miss it for the cross country skiing. And down in the metro, we have to go to artificial snow and take what we get. But the lack of snow cover consistently can have a big impact on trees in the urban, well, in any setting, but particularly in the urban areas we're seeing. And climate change really is the primary driver of all of our tree health issues that we're seeing, I guess you could say within the urban areas, but outstate as well in other wild areas. And the climate models for the Midwest region have been pretty accurate so far, where they've been predicting increased winter and spring precipitation and then summer droughts. That's been pretty steady over the last 10 years at least. And then here's the thing too, more days above 90 Fahrenheit or 32 Celsius, and then higher nighttime low temperatures. This has an impact on the energy collection and storage capability of trees because above 90 Fahrenheit, photosynthesis tends to just shut down or tail off. As trees get under moisture stress, the stomates of the leaves will close so that they preserve water. Well, at the same time, the trade-off involves you have to have stomates open for carbon to enter for one of those building blocks of photosynthesis. So the tree trying to preserve water is actually costing itself carbon capture at the same time. The higher nighttime low temps also mean that there's respiration that goes on all night long, where formerly when nighttime lows would get cooler, respiration could ease off a bit and not cost the stored energy budget that's there. So over a longer span of time, that adds up to a lower stored energy budget for trees. And we see trees just starting to go into decline for not directly identifiable reasons due to pest or fungus attack, those kind of things. So climate change is really kind of a compounding set of issues for trees and everything else. And this is, oh, I don't know how to take this, but the models predict that Minnesota is turning into Nebraska, that will shift over time over this next series of decades into more of a grassland biome than what we're known for, the Great North Woods. Well, the Great North Woods is really only northern Minnesota to begin with. The rest of our state, will have was originally prairie and savanna and then mixed hardwoods. But the capability to support that kind of tree cover seems to be going away, unfortunately. We get a lot of precip, as I mentioned before, earlier in the year, little to none later. Winter arrives later. There's not steady snow cover, and that adds up to conversion to grassland. Now, we could go on to a tangent too. I've heard speakers talk about grassland is actually a more effective carbon sink than forest anyway, because the biomass is held largely below ground. And if you burn off a grassland, you just rejuvenate it. If you burn off forest cover, the carbon goes in the air and it takes centuries to recapture it. But that's a whole other thing. Um, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about arborists and responding to building landscape resiliency. And there's not just a scientific problem of carbon and climate, but it's the human response that really has gotten in the way. That I call them the twin traps of denial and despair. On the one hand, denial will just say, well, this is all a hoax, it's not real, or this is just a big natural cycle. There's always been these periods that, we get hot, dry spells, and it's just part of the natural cycle. And if we just apply flex our human brains, we'll find technology to fix it, and it's all going to be fine in the end. If we, just, keep plugging along, doing what we're doing, it'll be fine. So I call that denial. And then despair is the other trap that people could fall into that says, well, it's too late to do anything about it. The bus has already flown off the cliff, basically. I can't do anything about it anyway. It's too big for me to make a difference. So that's too bad. But I look at it differently, that we have a responsibility to do something about what we've broken in the world. And that responsibility, you can break it down into components of response and ability. The ability to respond. It's up to us to intervene where we can. That there's beauty along with the brokenness, and we have to be inspired by the beauty and then build on that, but also not ignore what's broken and take concrete actions that can make a difference. So that's where I see a unique role for arborists, is that we've been taking care of trees and landscapes for a long time. We already have a lot of skills in our set that can respond to this situation that we find ourselves in. So applying what we know to make urban areas better places to live, that's what arborists do. Since we know that trees provide cooling, habitat for other non-human inhabitants of our spaces, stormwater interception, all these kind of things, and the social benefits. Who's going to want to live in this space, go to this park without that giant oak tree creating a big shady spot? This is Oakland, California, with the coastal live oaks there. I paste off this crown. It goes 90 feet from one edge to the other. And it's got a nice mulch underneath it, and it gets irrigation off from rainwater captured off the local buildings. And the older and bigger you can get a tree to grow, the more benefit it can provide. Since trees are made largely out of carbon. That's a lot of sequestration right there. And the shade is a local cooling microclimate. So the more that we can do this kind of thing, the better off we'll be. And the urban ecosystem approach, I think it's kind of new for arborists, but we're realizing that we can't just rely on wild areas to support biodiversity anymore. Maybe in the US, we're less up to date on this than they are in European countries, especially England, where developers now have to write up a plan before they develop an area of land or buildings that they'll have no net loss of biodiversity due to the development. So they're really strict on that and taking some proactive measures. And in the US, I think we've maybe kind of been more of the mindset, well, we've got a lot of open space, and whatever we do, there's going to be biodiversity somewhere or other. But at least arborists now, there's a growing sense of we're not just managing the individual trees, we're nested in an urban ecosystem, and we have to find other ways to coexist with other species, or we ourselves can't survive. The pollinator situation is a good example of that, that more and more public awareness of the importance of pollinators has come to the fore. And we need to construct functional ecosystems right where we live. It just makes life more interesting and engaging also. More people are tuned into these kind of things, and there's a public demand for it. And I think a big awakening that's occurring, or at least in my career, in my final years as I'm wrapping up, I've got about 4 more years before I retire. I'm really pushing on this note that keeping a tree from dying versus providing for a tree's living are very different things. And we have to take care of the whole system to support the web of life. For a long time as arborists, we have congratulated ourselves for saving trees. Like, oh, we invented this chemical we can inject into elms to preserve from Dutch elm disease, or we've rescued so many trees from emerald ash borer. That's fine. It preserves urban canopy, but it's not really taking into account, well, those trees are going to die anyway under a prolonged drought or soil compaction or all these other things that we have to really take care of the whole system that supports the life of the tree and not just congratulate ourselves for killing the bugs that are killing the trees. There's a bigger game to play than that. And if we recognize really what are trees made out of, sunlight and air, and the work of the arborist is to maximize the energy collection of trees. That's how I think of it as trees are energy systems. They're basically a solar powered tower that's built itself out of light and air. Through the photosynthetic process, carbon enters a leaf with water that's moved its way up through the root system. And then with sunlight energy, that gets rearranged into sugars and starches and the structural carbohydrates that build a tree. So our work is to maximize that energy collection and storage. So if we're doing that, that's part of this whole battle against climate change and the ups and downs of what we're experiencing right now. So I'm very partial to bur oaks, as you might notice throughout some of these slides. And this is one in Hopkins, Minnesota. It's dwarfing the house. I measured the height of this one is maybe 60 feet and the crown spread is 80 plus feet. It's almost like the coast live oak in California. But this is all built out of carbon, and look at all that nice shade that's provided there. So if we can do more of this, that's what we're after. And anyone who's studied plant pathology knows this concept of the disease triangle. It says at the base of it, you need these three factors in place to account for the arising of a disease condition in any given situation. A host within an environment that is attacked by a pathogen or a pest, and that environmental change causes host stress and loss of resilience, and that creates a greater opportunity for a given pathogen or a pest to occur in those situations. Seems like a very simple, basic concept, but there is power in it if you really start to drill down and look into the different facets of this model. An example here is bur oak blight, where the changing conditions that we've seen over the last 15 or so years, the spring comes earlier and it's warmer and wetter, right at the same time when bur oaks are leafing out. So the leaves get this infection that's a complex of fungi. It's probably not just one fungus, it's kind of a complex uh, co-occurring factors. And then that leaf that gets infected, the petiole remains stuck on the tree and then infects the next leaf that comes out the next spring. So it just builds up. But it's the arrival of different conditions. These legacy bur oaks that grew along the savanna, the edge, the tension zone between the forest and the prairie, they weren't really adapted to a lot of warm, wet spring weather that we tend to get, a few years in a row. This condition will show up. So there's other examples that you can look at through that disease triangle model that point to some of the latest diseases that we've seen as arborists in the last 10, 15 years. But
It was
I,
interesting.
oh, okay, I heard a little comment there. But it's another angle I'm taking on it is instead of the disease triangle, I want to reframe it as the health triangle because as arborists or practitioners, we're not wanting to center the pathology. We're wanting to put our focus on the wholeness and the function and trust that living systems have an equilibrium of health that they can maintain given the chance to do that. And so we take that same triangular model, and if we just change our focus to the health triangle, we can look at it and say, well, in what ways can we modify the environment with cultural practices to relieve the stress on the host? And that will reduce the opportunities for pathogens or pests to arrive. And maybe we even go so far as to modify the host itself in a number of ways. The most radical application of the host corner is when I removed the ash trees on my forested property in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin, and milled it up and turned it into patio furniture. If you don't have the host, well, then you won't have that pest situation arrive. But there's a lot of different ways you can look at this creatively as the health triangle. Because also, I think as the disease triangle, if I go back to that, disease is something that's already occurred and you're just reacting. It's what they'd call in safety studies or safety culture a lagging indicator, something that's already occurred. Health triangle, you're getting ahead of the situation and being proactive because action's going to always be faster than reacting to something that's already occurred. So with this health triangle, yeah, action's faster than reaction. And we can do a lot of things with cultural practices like proper watering, mulching, the use of biochar. I'm a big fan of biochar and soil work to remediate compaction and low organic matter. And planting choices, modifying the host, and structural pruning. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But a big thing that we can focus on is the impact of drought and moisture deficit in trees is a big problem because no water equals root death and no water reduces photosynthesis too. Well, if you have root death, the water's not going to be delivered up to the leaves where the photosynthetic activity occurs, and less water means less building blocks for the sugars that are built, and that's going to be lower energy production. Lower energy means less capability to resist pest attack, and the tree just starts dying back. The picture here shows on the left and the right of the street, trees on the right were irrigated steadily, and those on the left were not. And you just see the decline and the browning on the left side of the street there. And it's kind of a snappy little phrase one of my colleagues, Russell Kennedy, came up with. When roots dry out, they die out. And I think of the real strong visual image of a raisin versus a grape. And if you put that raisin in a glass of water, it'll rehydrate, but it won't turn back into a grape. This is kind of like root tissue. Once it dries out, it's dead. And rain is not going to rehydrate it back into a functional root. The tree needs to expend energy to grow new root tissue after that drying event has happened from a drought. So our recommendations, this just follows the U of M guidelines. Irrigation and watering tends to be shrouded with a lot of complexity and mystery to the point where your client might just say, well, I don't know what to do, and they just don't do it at all. If you do some watering of some kind, that's better than not doing any. But the U of M's recommendation is 10 gallons per inch diameter of the tree at standard height, 4.5 feet above the ground per week if you haven't had rainfall of at least an inch. And that little device there with the two holes in it, it's usually called a frog eye or an owl eye sprinkler. Just a really simple device you can get at a garden store for about $4 or $5. Not all garden stores have it, but it's easy to find them online too if you look up owl eye sprinkler. I'm a big fan of these. I've got one at home that I've had for probably 30 years, and they're just indestructible. You could drive your car over it, and there's no moving parts, and they're just metal. You just screw that on the end of a garden hose. And a pet peeve that I have is so much irrigation equipment has moving parts or made out of plastic and it breaks, not even all the way through a season. But an owl eye sprinkler, really simple to use, really low cost, and throws water out through a pretty big area when you put it on the end of a hose. So the guideline of how I figured out to use it is put that on the end of a hose, drop that into a 5 gallon bucket, and turn your spigot on full tilt, and then time how long it takes to fill that bucket. Then it's just a math problem after that to determine how long it takes to deliver the amount of water that you need to do. So hypothetically, if we have a 10-inch diameter tree that we want to keep happy, that's going to take 10 gallons per, well, 10 inches diameter times 10 gallons per inch is 100 gallons. And if it takes 60 seconds to fill that 5 gallon bucket, that's what it was at my house, then it means I need 25 gallon buckets to reach 100 gallons. That would be 20 times 60 seconds. Run that sprinkler 20 minutes per week for the 10-inch diameter tree. Then after that, let it percolate in, and you dig a hole to verify if the soil is moist 8 to 10 inches below the soil surface. And that verifying is always the important step. I've talked to lots of homeowners that say, well, my lawn sprinkler goes over into that area under this white pine. So, I'm not too worried about that, but I'm wondering why this white pine is looking so bad. Well, let's go and verify. So peel back the nice mulch layer that's about 4 inches deep, looks great. Well, then they got this fabric barrier underneath it, and I'll slice through that with my pocket knife and feel the soil under that is just chalky dry. That lawn sprinkler, all it's doing is getting the top of the mulch a little bit wet, but effectively no water has reached down into the root zone of that pine at all. So verification, checking by feeling, it should be like a wrung out sponge after irrigation, not soupy, too waterlogged or anything like that. But hopefully, the math in this isn't that difficult to just do 10 gallons per inch diameter per week. And the owl eye sprinkler makes it really easy. You can move it around to different zones, and you'd be surprised how far this can throw water. Then applying mulch, these are all really simple things that either the arborist can do for someone or homeowners can do themselves. So it should be an organic material. Rocks don't count because I've done this a number of times too. People use this big, dark, chunky rock stuff as mulch. And you pick one of those up on a day in the middle of July or August, and they're so hot you can't even hold them really. And then hand that to the client and they feel it. As an educator, I get if you demonstrate things to people with a hands-on experience, the message gets across a lot more than if you just tell somebody something. You tell somebody something, they maybe hear it, but they forget it 2 minutes later. You tell somebody and show them a picture, it gets in a little deeper. Show them a moving picture like a video, that's connecting more. But really, if you have them experience something physically, like here, feel this rock that you're using as mulch. Now imagine tree roots trying to grow underneath that. Not to mention there's probably 99 times out of 100 a black plastic barrier underneath that that's suffocating the roots at the same time. So rocks don't count as mulch. Use an organic material like this shredded wood material here, about 3 to 4 inches deep. Keep it away from the base of the trees a little bit. No mulch volcanoes or heaping it up against the stem of the tree. That causes a lot of problems with decay and turning the bark kind of mushy and more susceptible to injury. And again, I've already mentioned this, no plastic or fabric liner under the mulch. It doesn't serve any purpose. Even that fabric that's supposed to be there as a weed barrier, weeds grow through or on top of that anyway, and it doesn't really serve any purpose. If you saturate your mulch and then water tries to percolate through that, it's not really going to move through that effectively into the soil below. So I wish landscapers would just do away with all that plastic and fabric stuff. And here, the picture is from a study done by Gary Watson at Morton Arboretum a long time ago, where he showed with root ingrowth cores, these mesh tubes drilled underneath trees, where there was grass underneath and where there was mulch extended out to the edge of the canopy. Over time, you get about 5 times the volume of tree roots growing under mulch as you do under a turf grass situation. And that mulch leads to less compacted soil because there's more soil organisms living in there that are moving the organic matter through the soil profile. As it decays, it tends to bring the pH to more of an acidic balance where more nutrients are available for the tree. And you got that much greater volume of tree roots. And the soil becomes more of a carbon sink with more roots in there and more biological activity. That's going to just mean more carbon stored in the soil and better for tree roots and the mycorrhizal fungi that we know are crucial to tree health and survival. And mycorrhizae can live in urban settings. We don't often think about them. They're well known in forest soils, but wherever soil conditions are allowed to behave like a forest with mulch or, a grove of, say, conifers in an urban setting where the needles can just drop and settle there, the mycorrhizae will show up and drift in from wild areas. And this is some puffballs near Lake Hiawatha in Minneapolis under a grove of white pines. It's one of my favorite spots to visit on bike trips. But you can find mycorrhizal fungi even in urban settings. So we just have to set up the conditions for them to thrive. And it also points to why we need to preserve wildlands within and around urban areas, because those are the refuges where mycorrhizal fungi can go through their whole life cycle to the fruiting stage where spores drift around and then they can reach our urban plantings. If we're hopefully mulching and letting them behave like wild trees, spores can disperse into the new habitats from the wild or wild simulated areas. Here's a great tool. How do we get organic matter into soils when we've got compacted soils with low organic matter? Very typical for urban areas. We've got this uh, air spade is a tool. It's just an air gun on a compressor. It's the same one they would use to blow out your sprinkler lines in the fall for loosening compacted soil, getting composted organic matter mixed into a profile, and biochar, multiple benefits. I could do a whole hour just talking about biochar. We've been using it for about 10 or 11 years in our soil remediation formulas with compost. It's a stabilized form of carbon, for one. That's not going to decay and go back to the atmosphere as just atmospheric carbon. It stays there for the long term. Improve water and nutrient retention and all the little crevices in that structure of biochar. And it builds disease resistance. A lot of interesting work has come out of England. This guy, Glenn Percival from Bartlett Labs, has shown that the bacteria and fungi that they inhabit the crevices in biochar. They outcompete the pathogens in the soil for space, and their metabolites are actually kind of like antibiotics that tree roots can absorb and build their resistance against foliar fungus. So even without applications of fungicides to the leaves of trees, there's a great, like a 50% reduction in the rate of foliar disease without any use of chemical products, just from using soil applied amendments like biochar and a couple other things. So here's what that looks like. It kind of makes some noise, but it's very effective at fracturing up compaction and a stirring tool to mix in the biochar and compost. Then in the health triangle, we can also change or modify our hosts. Tree planting for biodiversity is something we're getting into, not just diversity of species, but genetic diversity within the species is important to consider as well. So much of urban forestry has been focused on cultivars coming out of nurseries like the autumn blaze maple, the Sienna Glen, all these really snazzy varieties. But personally, I'm much more into straight species, not the cultivars, because an argument can be made they're closer to the native trees of an area where lots of different insect species will be hosted and the cultivars are relatively sterile. Now, that could ignite a big debate between nursery people and plant breeders and arborists and ecologists, get them all into a room and no one's going to agree. But my own personal bias is towards straight species, not these cultivars. And putting a lot of emphasis on oaks. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Douglas Tallamy and his work. There's one book is Nature's Best Hope, and the other one is The Nature of Oaks, where he really emphasizes oaks as keystone species because they'll host over 500 species of caterpillars, and caterpillars are super important during fledging for birds. One speaker at the conference in March, Arborist conference we have here, she said that a batch of chickadee babies needs 6 to 9,000 caterpillars to reach maturity. And the parents are constantly flying back and forth all day long, collecting caterpillars, most of which are hosted on oaks and willows. And then the parents more or less drop dead after that, or they can just drop dead from exhaustion by the time they've fed thousands of caterpillars to the nest of babies. And birds will feed on dormant caterpillars even in the winter. So we need to have a range of species, especially the ones that host the insects that feed birds and other species. So it's not just about preserving individual trees and ones that are there just for amenity purposes and look good, but we're thinking a lot more about the biodiversity aspects of what we're doing with trees in the urban ecosystem. Then assisted migration, I'm sure you've heard a lot about that, or maybe engaged in that too, where we're moving trees beyond their normal range to help with climate resistance, helping to migrate some trees from the south in. And Minnesota, from what Lee Freilich, I heard him say about 10 years ago, that we could actually gain tree diversity by doing assisted migration. Yes, we're going to lose a lot of our conifers in the North Woods, but if we selectively move in other species like chinkapin oaks or other species like that, we could, if we played it right, actually increase our biodiversity. So that's a very interesting thing to consider right now. And then for arborists, the importance of formative pruning. Again, action is faster than reaction. When you get a small young tree, people might think, well, just let it grow. That's natural. Well, there's a lot of things that happen in nurseries that don't set the structure properly for a long life of a tree. And a couple of remedial cuts in the early life of the tree can avoid big disasters later. Prevention goes a long way to avoiding tear outs like this. And that big limb tearing out like that, a homeowner might say, well, that tree got struck by lightning. No, in most cases, your tree was not hit by lightning. It just succumbed to a structural failure that could have been avoided with the right structural pruning. A lightning strike on a tree will blow it to smithereens if the charge is enough. I've seen lightning strike at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum that blew a red oak into splinters 100 feet in every direction. or it makes just a spiral burn mark down to the ground as the electricity seeks the ground. But most of the time, when the homeowner or the tree owner says, my tree got hit by lightning and it split there, it was a structural weakness in the tree that could have been corrected with the right pruning when the tree was young. We're looking for something like this, preparing the tree to build a strong crown by getting a central leader and well placed secondary branches that have a good angle of attachment. And those trees can withstand stresses from wind loads a lot better than unpruned trees. And since we've got more intense storms and everything, structural pruning is something we're really doubling down on. And another talk I could do for an hour is just fractal pruning. You look at a tree like it's built up of fractal repetitions of the whole pattern of the tree. And there's a way of doing pruning that increases the fractal reiterations within the tree and strengthens it, where other forms of pruning might reduce the strength of the tree by removing more of those fractal reiterations. But that's just a way of saying in about 20 seconds, something that takes about an hour to really explain how it works. So there's the teaser. If you want to get into fractal pruning, invite me back. I'll do a whole thing just about that. So that brings me to the end, the whirlwind tour that, to wrap it up, arborists can do a lot to build landscape resilience. All these things, mulching, watering, structural pruning, soil remediation is a big thing I'm really committed to, and that we have a responsibility to fix what we've broken. There's a tendency to fall into either denial or despair, but if we look at what's broken, we can do what we can to fix it and then add to the beauty, recognizing trees are largely built out of carbon. So the more we can work with them to be big and healthy, the better off everything's going to be, ourselves included. And that action's faster than reaction. Work with a tree when it's healthy rather than trying to rescue it when it's already gone into decline. You can do that with cultural practices, and anyone can mulch or water a tree. You don't have to have specialized arborist skills to do that. That was a lot to pack into about 30 slides, but I'm around for any questions or discussion if we want to go into that.